The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Waking humanity, one soul at a time. This is the World You Don't Know radio show with your host, Nick O'Connell.
Now, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or should I say good evening. You're very welcome along to this week's edition of The World You Don't Know with myself, Mick O'Connell. And I've got a great guest on the line, waiting in the wings. I've got a gentleman called Andy Thomas from the UK. And Andy is, I suppose, you could say he's an expert in conspiracy theories and the evolution of conspiracy theories. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to go straight to Andy because this is a very important show, folks. As you know, my show started nearly 10 years ago now, and I started out with conspiracies, the first one being the JFK conspiracy. So it's quite apt that 10 years later we're doing a show about conspiracies as opposed to other subjects. And we're going to be covering a multitude of conspiracies. So I'm going to go straight to Andy. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning.
Or should I say good evening, because this show is going to be going out tonight at 9 o'clock. But we do know it's 10 o'clock in the morning. The evolution of conspiracy theories, Andy, where did it all begin?
I mean, I suspect you could probably go back to caveman times and you're going to have a belief in conspiracy, the idea that somebody has connived to basically fool a group of people into thinking one thing's happening when in fact something else is happening. And you can trace conspiracy theory right through history. I mean, if you just look at the Roman Empire a couple of thousand years ago, it is rife with a belief in conspiracies. Nobody ever trusted the emperors. There was a general assumption that they were all up to no good. And I find it quite interesting because today, of course, we're always hearing about fake news and all of that. Well, fake news has always existed, and we've never lived in a time where everybody believed everything the leaders said. And you can trace that across the centuries, again and again, the same patterns.
And what got you interested in conspiracy theories? I mean, I have a keen interest in conspiracies myself, hence the reason I started the show nearly 10 years ago.
Sure. I mean, you probably know yourself, it can start with one small thing and you start to get interested in finding out about that one thing, but then it leads you down to other avenues. And I was always interested in what you might call mystery subjects. And I really began with looking at things like UFOs and crop circles, which I was rather fascinated with. And indeed, I still am. But I realized very quickly when I was researching those, and that's nearly 30 years ago now, that the truth about them was not being told in the media.
And let's talk about crop circles.
Then, of course, you meet other people who are researching other related areas, and before you know it, you realize they're never telling the truth about basically anything.
Let's talk about crop circles. I'm fascinated by crop circles, and one of the reasons I am is I lived in a place in the UK called Warminster in Wiltshire, and it wasn't too far from Stonehenge actually. And I remember seeing a crop circle as a child, and I was running around inside the crop circle. Now, I don't remember if I felt any weird energies or anything like that, but I do remember the crop circle. So I've always had a lifelong fascination with them. But we're told by the mainstream media that crop circles are created by Paddy and Mick heading on their way home on a Friday night from the pub with a couple of paddle boards on their feet. But I don't buy that, because if you look at some of them, they're so intricate, there's no way could a couple of people have created them.
I mean, yes, there are some man-made formations, of course there are, and nobody would deny that, but you're right, there are many which are very hard to explain that way. We've had incredibly huge and complex patterns appearing in very short periods of time, often with eyewitness sightings, strange lights, all kinds of other phenomena. And when you put it all together, all you can say is that some crop circles are man-made, yes, but to say that all of them are really does not fit the evidence. And yes, that's another example, though, of the mainstream media just dismissing things with absolutely no grounds to do so at all. It's just that's the viewpoint they've got fixed in. And so they debunk because that's all they know how to do.
And what do you think is creating these crop circles? Is it UFOs creating them, or is there something more sinister that's Earth-made?
I think that we simply don't know what makes crop circles. There are many theories out there. Of course, some people believe there are other intelligences making them, and that cannot be ruled out. However, there's also evidence of a geological connection. Crop circles often appear near strong sources of underground water. There are many other things that might be contributing to them, and people have even found they can interact with them, seemingly, well, psychically or with the power of the mind. So I think there's something very complex going on that is not straightforward, and I think that's why nobody has ever quite nailed it yet. I think the ultimate answer will be a blend of theories, but over the years, my work with things like that have expanded out, and then once you realise that the media are always telling lies about all kinds of things, of course, then you get drawn into the wider conspiracy angle.
Now, for most people of the modern generation, conspiracies sort of, I suppose, begin with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And ironically, my very first show was about John F. Kennedy. I chose him because of the Irish connection. It's blatantly obvious Lee Harvey Oswald didn't assassinate John F. Kennedy. Even in modern times, they had some Italian sniper who was apparently one of the best snipers in Italy try and recreate what Lee Harvey Oswald was purported to have done, and he couldn't do it.
Well, I think this is the thing. The reason that we are still talking about the JFK thing, even today, is because there are so many complex and unexplained threads that the official investigations have never managed to nail down. There are many anomalies. There are many witnesses to things who at the time then died in mysterious circumstances. And I think there's now a hope that it's just going to drift away into ancient history and most people will forget all about it. But I'm pleased to see that it is something which has not yet gone away. And you often see that there is a pattern where the authorities are clearly hoping that a belief in conspiracy, whether it be about that or Princess Diana or 9/11, will eventually fade away and we'll all just see it as a historical note. But I think therefore that, those of us that can see the anomalies, it becomes us to keep pointing them out, keep it alive for future generations in the hope that somewhere down the line, we'll get nearer to the truth.
I mean, Jim Marrs, he wrote, and God rest the poor man, he was a great author and one of the world's foremost conspiracy theorists. He wrote the book Crossfire that the JFK movie was loosely based on. And in that book, he claimed that there definitely was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, that it has connections to the banking industry and stuff like that. Now, my theme tune for this show actually has the famous JFK speech where he's talking about secret societies and stuff like that. And in that speech, as I'm sure you've heard, he warns us about a monolithic conspiracy to enslave everybody, not just in America, but around the world. I mean, you've got some very, very serious vested interests there. And he's exposing them to a press association dinner I think it was in Washington at the time when he made the speech. That's a serious threat to their plans. I mean, all the more reason to take him out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general view today of those who trace the origins of the New World Order, which is, a very traceable, very clear project to put a lot of power into very few hands. The general view is that Kennedy was a threat to the New World Order. And I'm not saying he was perfect, but he clearly was not playing the game that had been laid down for him. And I think that he had to be removed. I mean, you'll often read long lists of possible people who would have wanted to get rid of him. But I think that there may well have been, more than one source. I think it also upset the mafia too. So people were queuing up really to get rid of him by the end. But certainly he was not playing the role that I think had been expected of him, and the New World Order had to remove him. And of course, then a few years later in 1968, they removed his brother Robert as well when he was making noises about beginning to stand for president. So yes, I think that there's a lot of grounds for believing that the Kennedys were seen as dangerous and would not have done what they were told, and so they had to be removed.
I mean, historically, Joe Kennedy had a lot of power, he had a lot of influence, but the conspiracy surrounding him goes that he was manageable. They could get him to do what they wanted to do, but what had happened was he got John F. Kennedy into the president's office. I think they wanted to have his dead brother who died in World War II to become president, but that never happened. So John F. Kennedy then was put forward, and he got the job then as the president of the United States. But he wasn't manageable, and at that time then I think Joe Kennedy had had a stroke. So they therefore didn't have his influence over JFK anymore. So that was probably one of the reasons to get rid of him, because they couldn't control him. Like his
Yes,
father could have.
and I think that that's right. And I think once that was realised, I think that's when they had to remove him. I mean, there are so many different threads to the Kennedy conspiracy theories. It's, of course, very hard to pin them all down in one go. But absolutely, there's a lot of people feel that there were many threads. The CIA were almost certainly involved in removing him. Some even blame President Lyndon Johnson as well, who famously, of course, always hated the Kennedys and had a lot to gain, and indeed then did become president after Kennedy had gone. So, I think when you start to draw sort of diagrams of all of this, and you link the different aspects of it up, you find it is a very complex web of intrigue left in the middle. And I think that's why it's never straightforward. And I think that's why the discussions still go on about it today.
So do you think that there most definitely was a conspiracy to take John F. Kennedy out at
Oh, yeah, I
government
think
level?
very much so. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald, it would seem, did fire some of the bullets, but the whole crux of the argument is that he really could not have fired as many bullets as we see in terms of the damage that was done, and that is where it is now presumed. And even at the time, many people said there were other gunmen present.
I mean,
There were shots coming from different angles, and that, of course, makes it not just one fanatic. That is a coup d'etat.
Oh, that's a conspiracy. I mean, you can see from the video footage of just prior to the JFK assassination, I mean, seconds before, his Secret Service agents who were standing on the back of the car were told to get off the car, and you can see a man looking all confused, like why are you telling me to get off the car? And then seconds later, John F. Kennedy is shot.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of weirdness going on there. I mean, some people, of course, have even pointed out that the driver, a man called William Greer, in the middle of all the shots going off, suddenly turns around and something odd happens, and some have suggested that he may have fired one of the bullets as well.
Yeah, I've
But
seen
there's
that.
another belief that somebody was in the storm drain nearby, and of course you've got the grassy knoll where people heard shots coming from over this wall at the top of this raised grass area in Dealey Plaza where the shooting took place. So yeah, it does certainly seem that bullets were coming from a number of angles. But it should just be pointed out here that in 1979, the American state did reinvestigate, and they produced a paper which did admit that there was a high probability, quote, of other gunmen being present. But then they just left that hanging. They never then went on to find out who the other gunmen might be. But in fact, the official view in America is that, yes, there was more than one gunman. And yet you very, very seldom hear anything about that.
And I think the investigation is now closed anyway. I mean, they come out with the Warren Commission, which was most likely just a whitewash of what actually happened. And it's been put to bed, I suppose. And it's only been kept alive by people like yourself and myself and other conspiracy theorists around the world who keep that story going.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where history will look back and it will be generally assumed that there was a whole other story to it, but, well, we'll probably never find out. But the danger is that you see that going on with events that have happened more recently. And again, you can see the authorities are just hoping it's all going to fade away into the background. But, well, we mustn't let that happen, because when that happens, that makes it easier for them to get away with stuff like this all over again. And that's why the memory of these things must be kept alive somewhere in the collective memory.
I mean, if you look at what happened with JFK in the 1960s, it's completely led up to everything that's gone on now, all the other conspiracies that we see out there, like 9/11 and 7/7 in the UK, which, John Anthony Hill exposed as a massive conspiracy. Are you still there?
Hello, we're back. Sorry, we lost each other
I
briefly
think
there.
you got cut off. I was just saying there that the JFK conspiracy, it leads on to all the other conspiracies that have become famous, I suppose, on the internet, like 9/11 and 7/7 in the UK. And in relation to 7/7, I mean, John Anthony Hill, he exposed that in his documentary 7/7 Ripple Effect. Have you ever seen that documentary?
Indeed so, yes.
And he was personally, I mean, he'd actually lived over here in Ireland in County Meath. Now, his reason for being here in Ireland, he said he was looking for the, I think, what was it called now? Not the Holy Grail. What's that other thing that is famous throughout history? That box thing.
You mean the that has the Jewish writings in it.
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of the name of the bloody thing now. But he reckons it's buried here in Ireland, and that's why he was here looking for it. But he got persecuted here by on Garda Síochána, the Irish police force. They raided his house. They took all his computers away. And on the 11th of the 11th, 2011, or 11 a.m., I mean, if you're into your numerology, that could mean something. He was extradited from the High Court in Dublin to the UK, where he stood trial. And the reason he stood trial was there was a trial a few years after 7/7 of some Muslims who the British had claimed had helped the original 7/7 suicide bombers. And what John Anthony Hill had exposed was that the suicide bombers in 2005 couldn't have done it. And he had DVD evidence, i.e. his documentary, to prove it. And he had sent a copy of that to the court where this second trial was taking place. And he was arrested then for interfering with the justice system and stuff like that, trying to pervert the course of justice. But he stood trial for that, and he was acquitted. Because the jury had gotten to see, his barrister was smart enough that he had convinced the judge to allow the jury to see 7/7 ripple effect. And the moment they seen that, they acquitted him within 10 or 15 minutes.
Yes. By the way, I've just remembered we're talking, of course, about the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant, sorry, that's what
talking
it
about
says,
that. This is an interesting point because if some of these theories, as people call them, were to come to court, it would very quickly become clear that there was a case to be made. And that is why I think the authorities are desperate that they never come to court. For instance, there is a very good campaigner called Matt Campbell who campaigns about 9/11. Now, his brother was lost in one of the Twin Towers. And Matt has been on a trail of trying to get to the truth of what killed his brother. And because he is family, he has certain privileges in that regard. And has been trying to campaign for, a case to be opened up so that all of the evidence surrounding 9/11 can come to court. But of course, nobody wants that to happen. And I think the authorities well know that if 9/11 was ever scrutinized in a court of law, the official story would fall apart in about 5 minutes.
Oh, it would.
And that's why they can't let that happen. And I think they're always going to try and keep this out of the public eye and certainly out of the courts.
So listen, I need to go to an ad break because I need to insert some ads into the show. Do you mind hanging on in the wings there for a couple of minutes and I'll play an ad? I have to play another one then in about 15, 20 minutes after that. So do you mind hanging on for a couple of minutes?
That's fine.
That's brilliant. Folks, we'll be back in 2 minutes with Andy Thomas. Talk to you all very shortly.
You're listening to Liffey Sound
on 96.4
FM.
Now, folks, you're very welcome back. Andy, you're still with me, yeah?
I'm still here.
Brilliant. Now, we just mentioned 9/11 there. That's, I suppose, for anyone who's interested in conspiracy theories, the biggest one that there is. The official story, 19 hijackers hijacked 3 airplanes in America, flew 2 of them, or 4 airplanes, should I say, flew 2 into the Twin Towers, 1 into the Pentagon, and then the other one just disappeared into the ground in Shanksville in Pennsylvania. I don't buy it, and I think most people with an ounce of sense in their brain wouldn't buy that story because it doesn't add up.
Well, I think when you start to look at the evidence, that's when you realise it doesn't add up. On the surface, of course, if you don't think about things, it all seems like it could have happened in the way we're told. But the minute you start to look at the actual detail of what really occurred, as opposed to what they say occurred, you realise there's a huge gulf between the two. And there are so many anomalies, it's almost hard to know where to start. You've got issues around the plane that hit the Pentagon. We have a plane with a wingspan of 120 feet or so that managed to enter a hole roughly 20 feet across. And when the authorities were asked, well, what happened to the wings then? Why didn't they leave a big hole? They said the plane probably vaporized. Well, these are the kinds of fairy tales that we are being asked to believe, because that's the only vaporizing aeroplane in the whole of history. There was minimal debris at the Pentagon. Many people said it was a small plane that hit. There were no bodies lying around, all very strange. Also, the man who was allegedly piloting this plane into the Pentagon, which dropped 7,000 feet in less than 2 minutes, turning a very steep and unnecessary arc, which many pilots say simply would not be possible in one of those planes. The man that apparently did this was one of the worst pilots that the flight school that had inadvertently trained him had ever had. They said he couldn't even handle a light aircraft. And yet the world is being asked to believe that on 9/11, he performed this incredible acrobatic that nobody has ever done in the rest of history. So we've got stupid things like that. Then you've got the entire laws of physics apparently being contravened by the way the towers fall down, with seemingly no resistance. There's clear visual evidence of explosives or some kind of device which seems to have been planted in the building to make sure that those buildings did come down as spectacularly as we see. And on the day, people in the buildings trying to get out kept saying there were bombs. There are many people who said there were explosions going off right across the length of the towers, and yet all of that is now edited out of any mainstream footage that ever gets shown. You will never hear about that. It's still there to be found on YouTube if you know where to look. Then you can see the authorities are doing a huge mass edit, because if those buildings were demolished, that opens huge questions as to who planted the charges, when did they plant them, how would they have got access. And the general view today is that 9/11 was effectively a New World Order move. Now, the exact names and the exact forces that would have allowed this or manipulated this to happen, you can still argue over. But it gave them the mandate for the wars that followed, for the restriction on freedom and the controls and the surveillance that they brought in on the back of 9/11. It was a gift. And you also have the major anomaly of the building number 7 at the World Trade Center, which came down later in the day after the Twin Towers had come down, and yet was never even hit by an aeroplane. It had minor fires on it, and yet down it goes like a pack of cards. And the general view in the truth-seeking world is that that is where 9/11 was at least partially coordinated from.
Yeah, I've always
and
held
they
that
had to
belief.
bring the evidence down at the end of the day, basically.
Yeah, I've always said that now in relation to Building 7, that was the command and control centre to bring down the 2 towers and then obviously get rid of the evidence, take that building down as well.
Well, I mean, what some people forget is that in all 3 towers that came down there, they don't just collapse. There is literally nothing left. They are reduced to a fine white powder. And that is evidence of something very high intensity going on. Many rescue workers said at the time it was weird. There were no like carpets or filing cabinets. Everything had been reduced to dust. Now, that doesn't make sense. If that's just something naturally collapsing,
Yeah.
all the floors that were not on fire, all that material should still be in there. And yet so many said it just literally, it had been burnt away to powder. So there's something extremely strange going on there. And yes, you're right. That was probably the hub of it all.
Have you ever heard of an author, Dr. Judy Wood?
Indeed so. And her views on what might have brought down the towers, I think, are very interesting.
They
there
are,
are arguments,
aren't they?
of course.
I mean,
There are
she
arguments.
claims that some sort of directed energy weapon was used to bring down the towers. That they literally dustified on the way down. And if you look closely enough at the footage, she's not wrong. They do look like they're dustifying, like turning into nothing.
Absolutely. I mean, they are not just collapsing; they are disintegrating into nothing, and this is a strangeness. Now, there are arguments about what devices might have been used to do that, and one thing that I think has become problematic in the 9/11 world is some people have got into rather vicious arguments about what kind of technology brought down the towers. To me, that's irrelevant to some degree, because we can all agree, looking at the footage, that that is not a natural collapse. So let's not get into arguments with each other about what kind of technology was involved. Let's accept that clearly these buildings were designed to come down and, to create maximum spectacle and fear, because that fear is still rippling around the world today. And every September the 11th, all the same footage replayed over and over on the TV, and it makes everybody fear, and it makes them then more subservient, more open to more control. And I think that was one of the big reasons that 9/11 was engineered in the first place.
I mean, one thing I have noticed, I mean, in the 3 or 4 years after 9/11, every anniversary, the TV would be blanketed with 9/11 documentaries, trying to convince us, I suppose, that these 19 hijackers did indeed do it. But over the years now, I mean, it's been nearly, 17 years since 9/11. And most millennials, they wouldn't care about 9/11. It's something that's from their parents' past, and they don't question it that much. But for people like ourselves, our age group in our 40s and 50s, it's something that still fascinates us to this day. I suppose my next big question is, if it is indeed a massive conspiracy, who could have carried something like this out?
I don't think, because I mean, some of the arguments against 9/11 conspiracy theorists say you would have needed masses of people to be involved. I don't agree with that. I think you would need only a fairly small team of people and just one or two important people within American command and control. And we should remember at this stage that there were exercises going on that day, which indeed visualized exactly what happened in reality occurring. So if you listen to some of the air traffic control recordings, you will hear when people are hearing about aeroplanes being hijacked, you will hear air traffic controllers saying, is this real world or exercise? They're confused. They don't know. And so that confusion, of course, would have been used to enable a lot of stuff to be going on without anybody really understanding why. Also, there are leading figures like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld who have very clearly lied about where they were on 9/11 and what they knew. Because one of the arguments is that they didn't know where the planes were coming in until it was too late. And yet many of their own staff have directly contradicted that and have said that they were present and knew what was going on much earlier than they say they did. So there is also a lot of evidence that even if they weren't directly engineering it, although many people believe they were, they stood back and they let it happen. And that morally is not much better. So again, it strongly suggests that there were enough people in important places that could have pulled this off. You wouldn't need 10,000 people involved. You just need a dedicated small team of people in very key positions. And it would seem that, that's what happened.
Now, George Bush, his role in this, I mean, if you cast your mind back to the moment he was told, where he was sitting in a school in Florida reading a book upside down, and his one of his agents came in then, one of his staff, and whispered in his ear that they were under attack, and he sat there then for 10 or 15 minutes, or well, looked like 10 or 15 minutes anyway, doing nothing. Do you think he had prior knowledge that this was going down, and that was like an oh shit moment for him?
There's two things to say about that. I mean, number one, this is one of the strangenesses of this whole thing. When the president was shown reading the story, excuse me, to school children, that was being broadcast. People knew where he was. And then when the first attacks occurred, they made no attempt to move George Bush from that school. Now, that school could have been a target. An aeroplane could have headed that way almost immediately, or they might have feared that it might. And yet nothing happened. It was clear that somebody knew no aeroplane was going there. And again, that strongly suggests people at certain levels knew very well where they were going. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that George Bush was in on this. In my view, it looks clear to me that he's got no idea what's going on. When his aide, who's a man called Andrew Card, comes into the classroom and he whispers in the president's ear that America is under attack, it's obvious George Bush just doesn't know how to respond. He doesn't know what's going on. He then vanishes for much of the rest of the day onto Air Force One, and there are rumors that there were threats against Air Force One. Some think that those that did know what was going on basically quietly then said to the president in the day, Mr. President, here's the truth of what's happening today. Are you with us or are you against us? And had he said he was against them, maybe Air Force One would never have landed again. And then by that evening, suddenly he's all gung-ho, and Bush, it would seem suddenly is more informed than he was. But I think that morning, and okay, this is a personal view, but it is the view of some other people too, that he didn't know what was going on. Later on in the day, clearly somebody had then brought him in on it.
But something he said, now, and it was broadcast on the news, and I haven't seen much of it since, was that he was asked, when did you find out that the Twin Towers were under attack? And he said, and I quote, I was in the back of the presidential limo, the Beast as it's called, and I seen it on the TV screens, and I seen the first plane hit the first tower. Now, no one had seen that until the news footage that that French documentary filmmakers had released later on that day. So no one had seen it until that news footage was released, so there's no way he could have seen it.
No, he couldn't. I mean, there again, you've got a classic Bushism because he said, well, I saw the TV footage and I thought, wow, that's one bad pilot.
Yeah.
You know, it's a great Bushism. But he couldn't have seen it because, as you say, that was not broadcast live at that time. But that doesn't, to me, mean that he was in on what was going on. I think that was him desperately trying to cover and trying to retrospectively explain what had happened and actually just messing it up and clearly didn't know what the true script was at that point. But I'm afraid he was famous for things like that. So that all sounds like some kind of desperate retrospective cover-up.
Yeah, I mean, he also said humans and fish can live peacefully, side by side. So I mean, what's that tell you about his
Well,
mentality?
indeed, yes.
He's a bit of a lunatic. Another thing, Shanksville. We have an Irish comedian over here called Andrew Maxwell. I don't know if you know him. He's on UK TV quite a lot, and he made a documentary about 4 or 5 years ago. He made two actually. He made one about 7/7, which he got something like £50 of Semtex to blow up a bus to make it look like that actually happened, and that there was a conspiracy to blow up that bus, and it was way over the top. What he did. But here's how he explained the Twin Towers and the plane in Shanksville. With the Twin Towers, and I kid you not, this was a genuine BBC documentary. I don't know if you've seen it. He used Lego to demonstrate how the Twin Towers collapsed. But to make matters worse, he used a bowl of flour and a marble to explain away what happened to the plane in Shanksville. I.e., he dropped the marble into the bowl of flour, and it created a crater in the flour, and then all the wall of the crater collapsed in on top of it. And he's trying to tell the viewers, this is what happened to the plane in Shanksville. And I couldn't help thinking, well, why haven't you dug it up yet?
Well, indeed, I have seen that program, and I'm afraid that was one of the desperate cover-ups of our time. This is what the media do.
It was
They
embarrassing to
give you
watch.
very shallow explanations, which make no sense at all when you actually apply them to the real world. A bowl of flour will not operate in the same way that hard earth will when it's hit by an aeroplane. So this is the kind of madness that the public have fed. And if you don't think, maybe you'll accept it. But if you actually do know anything about the way the real world operates, you'll know that cannot explain anything.
It was ridiculous. But as I said, it was, the majority of people, unfortunately, will believe everything that the BBC, spit out in a documentary. They'll believe what Channel 4 spit out in a documentary, or any other TV channel for that matter. Because, unfortunately, people place a lot of stock in what they see coming off that box in the corner of the room.
They do, although I think that increasingly less so. Certainly younger people these days, they don't watch mainstream television. They have their own news feeds. They watch stuff on Netflix. They have social media. So I do think, as it turns out, that at the moment, the grip of the likes of the BBC and ITV, I think it is weakening significantly. And where that's going to go in the future, I don't know. So, yeah, certain generations are still very susceptible to the propaganda they're fed. However, I do think that's changing. That can be good and bad because I think younger people are being exposed to more alternative news feeds now. But of course, the danger is then you don't get the bigger picture. You don't hear what the opposition, if you like, has to say, and you wind up in the echo chamber, as some people call it. But I do think also you've got the problem now of the internet being effectively censored. Things are being taken down off of Facebook and off of YouTube that are considered dangerous. And I'm seeing this happen a lot now. And if you search for things on Google, for instance, you will find that things that used to come up on the #1 page, they're now down on about page 7. And you've got to go through a lot of references before you get to what you want. And that is as good as removing something from the public gaze as anything you could do, because most people will never flick that far down. So I think there's a concerted effort now to try to neutralize the younger generations who've had access to all of this kind of stuff through the new kinds of news feeds. And I think that, though, is a sign of how desperate they are, because they know people are not just taking everything that they used to from the BBC and the likes. So I think we live in interesting times, but also dangerous times. And certainly I think any talk of conspiracy now is vanishing. YouTube is demonetizing companies that try to make programs about this, which means they can't afford to do it. And often videos are being taken down now, usually under the pretext of some copyright claim, which you never get to the bottom of. So I do think now we do live in an age where the freedom that we've had on the internet to talk about these things is now under threat. And I worry about where that will go. But we're going to need a lot more grassroots action, basically, and a lot more talking, and maybe even going back to printed material, because I think at the moment a time is going to come where it's going to be harder to get this information. We've lived in the golden age of that with the internet, but I think that is now coming to an end, sadly.
Do you think I've noticed now over the last, I got into this kind of, I mean, I've always been interested in conspiracies most of my life, UFOs and stuff like that as a child. But as far as the internet is concerned, I got into this maybe 15 years ago when I first got the internet in my house for the very first time. I was delighted like everybody else getting the internet. And one of the first things that I would have Googled in relation to conspiracies was who rules the world. That was one of the first things I typed. I can remember typing it, and a barrage of stuff came at me. The Rothschilds that rule the world, and next thing I started discovering then YouTube documentaries. I discovered Alex Jones. He's been virtually wiped off the internet over the last few weeks. And at that time, there was an abundance of stuff. I was able to research and do very deep research into an awful lot of subjects. You can't do that anymore.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the thing is, you and I will notice this, and anybody listening to this that looks for this kind of material, we will start to see that it's vanishing. The problem comes when new people trying to look for this stuff, they probably will not even be aware that it is there. And if Google doesn't give you the links, doesn't give you the references, in the end, they will just not even be aware that this stuff exists. Unless somebody gives you the direct URL or the website, you just won't know it's there. So this is a problem. It's a very serious problem. And it's clever. I think it's very clever on the part of the authorities, because what they've managed to do is to censor the internet without telling anybody that that's what they're doing. And under the guise of combating fake news, they've managed to shut down a lot of legitimate alternative inquiry, and it's wrong. And yet, it's happening so quickly now that I'm not seeing enough resistance to it, but maybe because people just don't know that it's happening. Now, I think that's the hope, so that in another 20 years' time, the majority of the public won't even know that you and I are talking about stuff like this. That's their hope, and we'll be then just reduced to a little backwater of the internet. This mustn't happen. We mustn't allow this to happen, but it's going to need a lot of people who really challenge this or create their own new alternative kind of internet that does not exist with these mainstream channels, and that they are the ones that get sidelined. But it's going to take an awful lot of concerted effort to bring that about.
And what can we do to combat this? I mean, to keep the truth agenda, I suppose, for want of a better word, alive?
Well, as I say, I think we have to do a number of things. I think we have to keep this information circulating. I think we need to basically, because if Google and Facebook and all of these mainstream channels, if they are going to just remove all of this material, then somebody in the know is going to have to create new channels whereby it can be shared. Now, I mean, there are, for instance, already alternative search engines like DuckDuckGo is one, things like that. But it's getting the word of them out to the mainstream public that's going to be the challenge. So it's going to need a lot of hard work, a lot of talking, a lot of campaigning. And if the mainstream outlets are simply never going to play ball, then new outlets have to be created. But that takes people in the know who can do it. And then we're going to be looking ultimately at sort of two kinds of internet. But it is an issue. So in the meantime, we've got to keep this material going by talking to people, by holding as many live events as possible, getting them out there. We need to tell our families, risk the ridicule, risk the attacks you might get when somebody doesn't agree with you, but don't go quiet. Because the day we all go quiet, I think that's a very sad and a very dangerous thing to do. So the conversations must be had. And as I alluded to earlier on, I think also what we're going to see is a return to the printed word finding its importance again. Pamphleteering, the distribution of pamphlets has throughout history spread a lot of this information and kept it going. And it's a shame that we have to do that, but it might be that we have to go back to things like that to keep it around. Yeah, I don't think there's an instant easy solution, but we all need to start making a noise now, because I'm still rather shocked at how few people seem to know that this is going on, but it is going on, and we now need to call attention to that.
And there are conspiracies here, there, and everywhere. Listen, I need to go to one more ad break, and do you mind hanging on for a minute or two?
That's fine.
That's brilliant, folks. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Andy Thomas.
You're listening to Liffey Sound
On 96.4
FM.
Now, folks, you're very welcome back. Andy, you're still with me, are?
I'm still
Very
here.
lovely. One more big conspiracy I want to talk to you about in relation to conspiracy theories in general is 7/7, what happened there, because you do live in the UK, so that would be something that would be close to your heart. The 7/7 attacks in 2005, I've done a lot of research into them, and I've seen a lot of documentaries. I've interviewed a good few people in relation to it. I certainly most definitely do not buy the official version of events. How about you? What's your view on it?
Yeah, I think there's many unanswered questions, and I mean, some of these became very clear very early on. For instance, the train that the bombers allegedly caught, which was officially released in the original news releases, never ran. I mean, it actually was cancelled that morning. Now, later on, the authorities tried to backtrack and said, "Oh, sorry, we got that wrong. In fact, they were on this train." But immediately, that started to raise some eyebrows. And just as with 9/11, it transpires that there were exercises apparently going on across London that day, which again had visualized exactly the same kinds of events, bombs going off, even at the very places that they did, as actually then happened.
Yes, a company
Yeah.
called Voiser Consultants were running an exercise. If I recall, a gentleman called Peter Power was on the news that day where he exclaimed that they were running an identical exercise to everything that actually went down.
That is right. And I think he said that not realizing when he first said that on the radio, the implications of
Yeah.
what that would mean. And later on, when he was quizzed about it, he went quiet and nobody would say anything more about it. But I think he was just telling the truth of it as it was. So was it that somebody, had put these exercises forward knowing that then real bombs would go off? Or was it that somebody knew these exercises were going along and decided to use that moment of confusion to plant real bombs? Well, that would seem like a very unlikely thing, because how would they have known? That suggests that somebody would have, had access to what would have presumably been a very secret exercise. So you've got massive issues like that. You've also got issues like, if you read some of the reports, and I mean in mainstream newspapers, not in just conspiracy feeds, quite a few people on the trains, for instance, and there is some TV news footage that backs this up, say that the explosions were not from the rucksacks which the bombers, alleged bombers, were carrying, but came up from beneath the trains, almost as if the bombs were either attached to the underside of the trains or were on the tracks. And some of the images do seem to suggest a blast coming up from beneath the trains.
Yeah.
So now that is quite a different story, therefore, to what we're told, and a lot of people have wondered who those bombers really were. We are told that one of them made a recording and did seem to be a suicide bomber, but there's a lot of fears around that. Was that fake in its own right? So I'm afraid it's one of these things where it's very hard to get to the bottom of it, but of course questioning something like this is difficult. You've had, some of the victims and relatives and people like Rachel North getting very, very upset about anybody questioning the official events. But then, of course, the moment that happens, somebody else will come along and say, yeah, well, they're part of the cover-up. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think we can safely conclude that the truth about 7/7 has not been told.
No, I remember exactly where I was when I heard about 7/7. I was sitting on a building site in a truck waiting to be offloaded, and there was a delay, so I was sitting there listening to the news. And around 10 o'clock, it came on the radio that there was an attack in London, and I says, "Oh, here we go again, London's under attack, mad Muslims." I mean, I was believing what most people would believe, that it was mad Muslims and these extremists that were trying to plant bombs in England and killing main people. But one interesting thing that I heard, and this ties in with John Anthony Hill's documentary, was that there had been a shooting down in Canary Wharf, that some people had been shot dead. Now, it was only ever said once on the news that morning at 11 o'clock, and I never heard the report for the rest of the day. And it didn't dawn on me, not for years did it dawn on me. It was only when I watched 7/7 Ripple Effect, and John Anthony Hill put the theory across in that the guys who were blamed on the 7/7 attacks had, as you rightly pointed out a few minutes ago, had missed the train because it didn't run. They got a later train to London, realised that, hang on a minute, there's something going on here. We're being set up because the attack had already unfolded. They had then made their way down to Canary Wharf, where all the mainstream media outlets were now located, as opposed to being on Fleet Street, and they didn't make it to the to Canada Square where they wanted to get to. That they were all taken out. What's your theory on that? Do you think that's viable?
I think it's possible, and I mean, I have to say, I don't know enough to make a clear judgment on that, but I think it is a possibility, and we need to put that together with the claims at the time, of course, of things like the bus. So on 7/7, the bus which exploded in Tavistock Square. There was one claimed witness who said that something strange happened, that the bus was in fact diverted into a different road. And that where it actually went off is not where the bus should have been. There is a claim that something strange happened with the nearby cars, forcing the bus to go down into the place where it then exploded. And there's a lot of strangeness about the bus, and it had, for instance, an advert on the side of it, which, okay, admittedly were on other buses too, with an advert for a horror film. With had the slogan something like "outright terror, bold and
Bold and
brilliant,"
brilliant, yeah.
which of course some say, well, that's part of the whole psyops thing, and anybody seeing that on the TV, in a way, it's telling you what's going on there. And terror, of course, controls us, because the more we are terrified, the more we will ask for more controls, and more controls are then duly given. So I mean, whatever the truth of 7/7. This is, of course, not the only attack that's happened in Britain over the last few years. There have been others since. Immediately, you now get conspiracy theories. Some people even say they never happened at all and the whole thing's all hoaxes, which I think is more of a stretch without very clear evidence. But what it does demonstrate is that, there is a gulf now where people simply do not trust the authorities to tell them the truth about something. And it's because of the glaring anomalies over things like 7/7 and 9/11 that you can't really blame people for immediately questioning what they're told through mainstream channels.
Now, in relation to stuff not happening and being put out there as actually happening, the Woolwich attack, where Lee Rigby allegedly had his head cut off by Muslim extremists. I interviewed a guy a couple of years ago called Chris Spivey, who has written a couple of books in relation to this, and he has been persecuted by the UK authorities as well over his books. But he claims that whole thing was a hoax, that there was no Lee Rigby, that everything was all staged. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of Chris Spivey's work. What I would say to that is that the issue we've got now is because there is an instant assumption that the authorities are lying. Of course, people naturally will just question the first thing they're told. And when the evidence for something is not clear cut, and I think there were strange things about the Lee Rigby case, and some of the circumstances of what happened still seem a bit unclear today, immediately doubts are sown. I think, however, the problem comes with then the next thing that happens is that goes around social media, that there are anomalies. And then some people say, well, maybe it didn't happen at all. That then goes round as a more solid fact and so on. So there's been a whole string of things, from the Lee Rigby thing to the Westminster Bridge attack, where now a lot of people say the whole thing was staged. We're crisis actors, as some call them.
And do you think they would do that, the authorities?
I have an issue with this slightly, in as much as there have been, I do believe, genuine events, or not genuine events, where these kinds of things have been staged. Just to give you one example, there's footage that I think you can still just about find on YouTube in Iraq, where you see a truck bomb goes off in a street. And shortly after it goes off, suddenly a load of people run into the road
and lie on the ground,
pretending to be injured.
I've seen the video,
Because, of course, that would then give them more sympathy. That's going to draw more attention to the events that are going on there. So it clearly has happened. And I think this kind of stuff does happen. I think the issue, though, I have with something like the Westminster Bridge attack is the amount of people that you would need to hire to either pay actors to, play these roles, or mind control them to play the roles, whatever way you do it. the numbers of people you would need to pull it off, I think, are too big to be credible, because you have to have not only the victims, but you then presumably then have to have actors playing the policemen and the rescue workers who are going to very quickly see that this isn't real blood, it's just tomato ketchup. Then you've got the people at the hospitals who apparently are also actors who are, receiving the victims in. But if there are no victims, what's going on? Are they just lying about what's happening at the hospitals? Then you've got the relatives. That was true of the Lee Rigby case. So the relatives, the people that claim to know the victims, if the victims never really existed, who are the relatives? Who are the people showing up at the funeral? And at the other end of it, when you count the amount of people that you either have to pay to front this or that you have to mind control, and Darren Brown and people like that have shown that it is possible to mind control people. Nonetheless, it's so huge that it strikes me. Well, two things strike me. One, I think sooner or later somebody would either break their programming or they wouldn't be paid enough. They'd come forward, they'd blow the gaff, or you basically then have to say that the other way this would get exposed is that if you've got this going on such a huge level, it would just expose itself one way or the other somewhere down the line. And why wouldn't the people perpetrating this hoax just really do it, rather than have to mind control or pay all these hundreds, literally thousands of people to do it? Why not just mind control one or two people to actually go and do this atrocity? Because the powers that do seem to do things like 9/11 have not shown much conscience up to now. They seem more than happy to kill people when they need to. So why go to all the trouble of mounting a massive hoax that could be so easily exposed when they might as well just do it? So these are my issues around it, and I do accept there are many unanswered questions about some of these events, but I think that knee-jerk denial now that just says, well, they never happened, that needs an awful lot of evidence to back that up. Personally, I'm not seeing it with a lot of these claims. I accept there are anomalies, and I don't know entirely, therefore, what the truth of it is. But I think we need to be a little bit careful before we just deny almost immediately any attack that's happened without really, really clear evidence. Because without that really clear evidence, of course, then the whole thing gets shot down in the public eye, and then the more credible conspiracy theories all get brought down by association at the same time. So I do think that is a problem.
What do you think about predictive programming? I mean, I've looked into this and symbolism and stuff like that in the movies where they're predicting the likes of 9/11 and 7/7 and, other such world events. The X-Files, for example, or the follow-up to the X-Files, which was called The Lone Gunman. There was a scene in that where they were flying remote-controlled airplanes into the Twin Towers. And they're putting these kind of things in the movies over the years. Is it to warm you up to it that, when it does happen, it doesn't shock you as much and stuff like that? Or do you think, as Jordan Maxwell says, I'm sure you've heard of Jordan Maxwell, he says, if you believe in the Illuminati and all that, and they are controlling the world, that when they're doing these events, they have to tell you they're going to do them. So they put them into the movies, into songs, into films, into cartoons, because for them it's a form of magic, so they have to tell you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've met Jordan Maxwell. He's a really interesting guy. I think that's a possibility. I think there are clearly PSYOPs programs going on, and I think we are often manipulated. Where I think, though, there is another way of looking at this is that, I mean, in some of my writings, in my book, The Truth Agenda, for instance, I do look at the power of collective consciousness and indeed psychic fields. And it's pretty clear when you look at the evidence that's been gathered from experiments over the years that there is such a thing as presentiment. That is where people actually get a sense of what's going to happen in the future. And sometimes that can operate quite a way in the future. So is it that we are being manipulated and having our minds played with? Or is it that certain huge events in the future just kind of ripple backwards into the collective mind and then start to appear in fiction and in images and that before it happens, because it's almost like the future seeding itself in our minds, which are anticipating these events. So I'm not sure that there aren't actually slightly more metaphysical reasons for why this might occur. I mean, you get there is that, I mean, let's take the 9/11 symbolism. some people have pointed out, if you take the Supertramp album, Breakfast in America, Supertramp, great 70s band, you've got the New York skyline made up from various kind of breakfast implements and coffee pots and stuff. Very clever cover. But if you sort of bend the cover around, you seem to get an inference of what's going to happen on 9/11. The problem there to me is you've then got to sort of say that if that's a specific psyops, which is, more than 20 years before the actual event would occur, that somebody in a record company working in the art department had been told what was going to happen and managed to keep that quiet all that time, despite being probably coked up and full of alcohol and, drugs and rock and roll and all of that. Would they really be able to keep that secret all that time? And that's where I think it starts to look a little bit stretched. And I think it's more interesting to consider that these, in fact, are ripples coming back from the future. And believe me, there is a lot of evidence that that is the way the world works.
It's a strange one. Listen, we've got 3 minutes left. You're going to be appearing at the Open Minds Conference this weekend.
Yes, that's
in Waterford. Now, I'm going to be down there myself, so we'll be able to meet up and have a drink together. Would you like to just give a brief outline of what you're going to be talking about?
So I'm going to be doing 2 presentations. Now, the one that I'll be giving on Saturday is looking really at the big picture of conspiracy, looking back at its history and seeing how these patterns of conspiracy have just come back over and over across the years. And that is something which will then, in a way, lay the ground for what I'm then going to do on the Sunday, which is to look at some of the current events, see how the patterns are unfolding right now, and also trying to have some positive thinking, because it's very easy to get very gloomy with all of this kind of stuff, and to find ways that we can approach these very complex times, these slightly worrying times, in a way that actually helps us through. Because although they are complex and they are worrying, they are in fact not the darkest times we've ever lived through, no matter what the media keeps it likes to keep trying to tell you. And I'm going to show ways that we can cut through that and try to cut through more quickly to the truth of what's going on. So, the 2 talks are really going to dovetail with each other. And hopefully at the other end of it, people will come out feeling a little bit more empowered, because it's very easy to wind up feeling disempowered. By
and that's the whole nature of this event that Trevor Evers and Laura Crane and the rest of that team down in Waterford have put on, and it's an absolutely fantastic event. This is my second appearance I was at the first one, and I'm looking forward now to going to the second one. Do you have a website, Andy? You do. If you want to give out your URL to people, so they can go and have a look at some of your work.
Yeah, it's truthagenda.org, truthagenda.org. And there's articles up there, there's videos to watch, there's lists of upcoming dates of talks that are coming up and stuff. So, yeah, have a look there and you'll see what I get up to. Lots to look at, lots to read. So that's truthagenda.org.
That's brilliant, and people can find you. Andy, listen, thanks very much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to meeting up with you officially at the weekend.
That will be brilliant. I look forward to it.
Well, listen, thanks very much, Andy, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Cheers now.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that was the wonderful Andy Thomas there. Absolutely fascinating interview. I really, really did enjoy this interview. It will be broadcast tonight, but you're going to hear that anyway. The Open Minds Conference is on this Friday, Saturday and Sunday, folks. It has finally arrived. Trevor Evers and all the crew have put on an absolutely fantastic lineup. There's going to be some great guests, including Andy Thomas, who I've just been speaking to. So I really, really do look forward to that. I'll be heading down to Waterford myself on Friday, spending 3 days down there. So it should be an absolute cracker. There are still tickets available. So if you do want to jump on a train or on a bus and fly down to Waterford this Friday, do it. It's going to be a great event, and it's not to be missed. And fair play to Trevor Evers and the rest of the team. There's an absolutely wonderful bunch of people for putting this on. Anyway, folks, this has been The World You Don't Know. And remember, as I always say, the world is full of wonderful people. If you can't find one, be one. Until next time, folks, you take care, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Bye-bye.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Waking humanity, one soul at a time. This is the World You Don't Know radio show with your host, Nick O'Connor.